Hello and welcome to this film, which is all about the reactions of acids. So here we're going to start looking at the chemical reactions that acids take part in, and we're going to understand how we can determine what products will form in those reactions depending on what the acid's reacting with, and in particular how we identify the salt. Okay, now here are the reactions in general that we need to know about. Okay, we're going to look at these in a bit more detail as the film goes on. But let's just introduce three types of reaction. So they are the acids reacting with metals. If an acid reacts with a metal, it will produce a salt and hydrogen. Acids reacting with bases. Now bear in mind, bases can be metal oxides or hydroxides, right? And if an acid reacts with a base, it will produce a salt and water. And finally, if an acid reacts with a carbonate, or a hydrogen carbonate for that matter, it will produce a salt and water and carbon dioxide. So they are our three general reactions. And before we have a look at particular examples of those, let's have a look at what we need to do to identify the salt. Because what you might have noticed in all three of those equations, we had a salt present. So we've got to be able to decide what the salt is going to be. And the way we do that is we say to ourselves, right, well, there would have been a positive ion that would have been contained in the base or the carbonate or the hydrogen carbonate, or which the metal could have turned into. So we're going to take that positive ion and we're going to combine it with the negative ion from the acid. Remember, the negative ion from the acid is the thing that the acid will form when it loses H plus ions. So in other words, it will be the conjugate base of the acid in most cases. Let's have a look at some specific examples, okay? Here's an acid reacting with a metal, producing salt and hydrogen. Now, it is important to realise that whilst acids will react with most metals, there are metals that acids won't react with. There's particularly unreacted metals, and they're copper, silver and gold. By the time you've done the redox topic, you'll understand why that is, okay? So acids will react with all metals apart from those three. They'll produce a salt and hydrogen. If magnesium were to react with hydrochloric acid, we'd have a magnesium ion in the salt. So our salt would be magnesium to begin with, and chloride to end with, because we've got a negative ion called a chloride ion in our acid. And the formula will be MgCl2. Hopefully you can come up with that yourself. And hydrogen is always H2. We could have a look at that in an ionic equation where we get rid of the chloride ions because they're basically not doing anything here. And we can see that magnesium ions are basically reacting with two H plus ions and turning into Mg2 plus ions, which we should be able to see in that formula, and hydrogen. And we can also say that in general, any metal M will react with any whole number, well, with a whole number of H plus ions to produce a metal ion with that whole number charge and X over 2 hydrogen molecules. So if my metal formed a 3 plus ion, it would react with 3 H plus ions and form 1.5 molecules of H2 for every atom of M that reacted. Now let's have a look at acids reacting with bases. And remember, they produce a salt and water. You might also remember from the energetics topic that this is called a neutralization reaction and that it's always an exothermic change. We'll have a look at why that is in just a moment. Okay, let's now have a look at a specific acid. So in this case, we've got ethanoic acid. It's reacting with a base, a metal oxide. Here we've got copper oxide, and it's forming copper, because remember the salt here is going to have the positive ion from the base and the negative ion from the acid, so copper ethanoate. It's very important to know the names and formulas of these ions, okay, but presumably you've got that all under control by now, right? And water is the other product. If we took sulfuric acid, remember, is diprotic. Here it's reacting with sodium hydroxide, which isn't an oxide anymore, but it's a metal hydroxide, okay? And they're producing sodium sulfate, right? Because the negative ion in sulfuric acid is the sulfate ion, even though when it breaks up once, it forms a hydrogen sulfate ion. So in other words, it's breaking up twice here. Sodium sulfate, because the sodium ion was in the base, and water molecules. Okay, we've got 2's here to balance it. Essentially, in this second equation, what we can see happening is that H plus ions are reacting with OH minus ions and producing water. Here you can hopefully see that we're making bonds. And every time you make bonds, it's an exothermic change. What you might also be able to see is that if this is the reaction that's basically taking place every time an acid and a hydroxide react, then we should expect the enthalpy change to be about the same for all neutralization reactions, and indeed that is the case. Now, let's have a look at carbonates. Now, bear in mind, this is also true for hydrogen carbonate. So if I take an acid and a carbonate, I'll make a salt and water and carbon dioxide. If I take an acid and a hydrogen carbonate, I'll make the same products. Sodium carbonate reacting with nitric acid. Positive ion is sodium, negative ion is nitrate. So our salt here is sodium nitrate, right? Sodium nitrate and water and carbon dioxide. Take sulfurous acid, not sulfuric acid, but also in our list of important acids, and react it with a hydrogen carbonate now. So HCO3 minus is the hydrogen carbonate ions formula, another one that we should be familiar with. But again, notice here we've got a negative ion called the sulfite ion, positive ion here called the potassium ion. Potassium sulfite is our salt. Water and carbon dioxide are our other products. And so essentially in these reactions, what we've got going on is that the carbonate ion or the hydrogen carbonate ion are reacting with either 2 or 1 H plus ion and producing water and carbon dioxide. Right, well there you are. That's all the acid reactions that you need to be familiar with for the acids and bases course. Hopefully you can make sure you try and remember them, okay, so that you know what acids react with and you know how to also identify what salt forms. If any of it didn't make sense or if you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to come and see me or to post a comment on YouTube.